So a few weeks ago, or a few months ago, by the time I'm actually recording this. Happy New Year, by the way. But anyway, a few months ago around midnight, I lay hunched over in a drunken stupor, burnt out from writing more anime scripts than I'll ever edit, and half-finishing songs, when suddenly, a gift from the heavens lay before me. A handful of anime channels reposting the second teaser for Science Saru's Ghost in the Shell anime adaptation. And let me just say that, unsurprisingly, I was not expecting to be all that excited by what is, in reality, nothing more than a minute-long teaser, featuring our first look at a little bit of music and a literal handful of production materials. But that's a freaking teaser. Immediately, I could not wait to see what Science Saru would do with the Ghost in the Shell franchise. Like, my imagination was running wild as to what the possibilities might be. Thus, this video. So yeah, the music here perfectly fits the Ghost in the Shell sounds that I'm used to, and it's just awesome getting a look at all these early concept production materials in such an awesome presentation, which, funny enough, it actually even seems like a lot more material than it really is. After I drugged the video into the editing bay and chopped it all up, I quickly realized that it's literally 26 images total. They've just been flipped and cropped and overlaid and timed differently with the music throughout, which is just, well, kudos to the editor of this teaser, man, to take 26 images and a minute of music and spit something this hype out. Give this man a raise. Anyway, the art in the character sheets obviously looks much more in line with the original manga, and of course somewhat like the retro-style visuals of the old PlayStation video game cutscenes as well, which are essentially the only animated pieces of media that actually genuinely resemble the original manga, and even in that case with some minor adjustments still. It's worth pointing out that the first teaser for this anime was also literally just animated manga panels from the original manga, so I'm sure that Science Saru will at least somewhat add their own touch to the art style given their usual stylized approach and the latest promo art from character designer Shuhei Honda. But there's also this older promo art from the original teaser floating around, which features a Fuchikoma instead of the Tachikomas famous from the standalone Complex series, and said illustration is, well, it's literally just a one-to-one recreation of one of the very first color pages in the original manga, so I don't think there's really any arguing that they aren't aiming for something much closer to the OG Ghost in the Shell manga, at least visually. But anyway, here's Bato, including his especially pudgy nose and squashed muscular build. Here's the Chief Aramaki, complete with that fully stylized cylindrical jaw. And of course, here's Major Motoko Kusanagi, pretty well emulating that classic aesthetic. In my opinion, the perfect mix of cute, sexy, and badass, all in one sleek cyberpunk package. I also really love how this first concept art of hers shows off just how nimble and agile she is, running across walls, doing flips, and hopping over stuff in sleek, flexible, acrobatic fashion. There's also once again the two promo arts of her, so here's all of that all in one place for your viewing pleasure. I'm gonna come. Those are, however, the only characters we've gotten a look at so far. Everyone's favorite traditionalist Toga is missing so far. Same for Saito, Bulma, Ishikawa, and Pazu so far. Anyway, that's all for the core cast, but we do have this shot of the Fuchikoma's concept art. Here's some more tech, some sort of retro sci-fi pager-inspired communication device, I'm assuming. And here are a couple of the weapon designs which Masamune Shirow is almost as famous for as his many sexy, nude, or scantily clad sci-fi and fantasy anime girls. Weapons which I'm sure they'll be using in Section 9. And most of all, we got a pile of concept art for the world itself. This little cityscape environment shot, a couple of what I'm assuming are crime lab interior shots, These two interior shots, which I'm assuming are either part of Section 9 headquarters or perhaps more likely just unrelated mansion slash megacorp interior shots. An exterior street level shot of the Sagawa Electronics building. We also got a shot of this canal, which seems extremely familiar to me, but I'm not really sure from where. We also got this city top downward facing shot, once again overlooking a building marked by the Sagawa Electronics brand. Another dense cityscape shot overlooking some construction, a large roadway, and maybe a dam, question mark. Another lab interior shot containing either brain cases or full cyborg bodies, kinda hard to tell which, to be honest. Some sort of building or outpost overlooked from the jungle, a couple of other shots overlooking what appears to be some sort of oceanside facility, and this shot, which I believe is just a hodgepodge of a ventilation shaft and a couple of those sliding elevator doors from different angles, I think? I don't know, it's kind of tough to tell what's going on in this one, to be honest. This one in the top left corner looks just as much like a manhole cover as it does an elevator door, but it may just be one of those shots constructed to compare the scales and angles of different objects and characters or something like that. After all, we see Motoko like floating just off screen, almost implying scale comparisons or something, but I don't know. Anyway, this is also my cue to get back to reading the manga ASAP. I might know what more of this was if I would just stop putting that off, but anyway, let's talk about studio and staff stuff. Obviously, Science Saru is known for bringing a lot of inventive, exaggeratedly expressive, and dynamic animation on the regular, so I think that we can look forward to all these designs and concepts really being brought to life, or perhaps larger than life, in the final product, especially seeing as we were given a decent look at pre-production materials around 8 months ago, long before the show will be starting sometime later this year in 2026, with the date itself still unconfirmed. There was speculation floating around about 2 months ago that it would be airing on Japanese TV this month in January 2026, but that was actually just a total misunderstanding, I think originating from this Reddit post. January is simply when the Japanese TV time slot that it will eventually be airing in begins. It's when the Japanese TV time slot begins, not when the anime begins airing in said time slot.
People just say stupid shit all the time.
Anyway, just in case anyone else was misled by those posts, just wanted to clarify that. The director for this project, making his directorial debut, is Moko-chan, who worked as assistant director on Dandadan. He also storyboarded and directed the ED as well as episode 4, which might I remind you was a freaking phenomenal episode. Frankly, maybe even my favorite episode visually after seeing the mood lighting and the inventively dynamic chase scene. And I'll spare you me just listing a bunch of his credits, but here's some of that other stuff on his AniList credits page.
That's pretty good, right?
The character design and executive animation director is Shuhei Honda, who got his start in Gainax and is currently a freelancer with a seat at Studio Trigger. He worked on all of this stuff, so yeah, I cannot possibly say I'm worried about this guy. Hell of a resume. The scriptwriter is Injo To. He handled the script for Godzilla Singular Point in 2021. I did not even know this show existed, to be honest. Perhaps more importantly, he also handled 2 episodes of Space Dandy. Episode 11, I'm Never Remembering You, Baby. And episode 24, An Other Dimensional Tale, Baby. Yeah, honestly, that just isn't enough for me to know what to think of him, especially as the script writer for Ghost in the Shell specifically. These were certainly inventive episodes full of wacky sci-fi concepts, like every episode of Space Dandy, so it's good to know that he's worked with sci-fi before, but this really just isn't enough for me to lean towards optimism or pessimism one way or another, since Space Dandy is obviously an incredibly eccentric show and the culmination of a lot of very specific talents coming together on one production. So to be completely honest, unfortunately this is the one major piece of staff information that I really feel almost nothing but uncertainty about, and that is the scriptwriter. So, if they do end up sticking faithfully to the original manga's plot, that's probably nothing to be all that worried about. But if it is an original story, who knows what it actually holds in terms of content or quality. But anyway, here's hoping for the best. We've just gotta wait and see what this iteration of the story is going to look like. Every iteration thus far, to my knowledge, has basically been a standalone story of sorts, or a relatively loose interpretation of the world, story, and characters of the original. So, will they create something more faithful to the OG manga, as has essentially never been done before? Or will they do something totally new with the franchise? I feel like all signs point to us finally getting a more direct adaptation of the original, but I think it's frankly just still too early to say. But speaking of iterations, we did get one very quirky quote from the original author, Masamune Shirow, alongside this teaser trailer. So, I quote, "Anime adaptation-wise, this new The Ghost in the Shell marks the fourth version following those by Mamoru Oshii, Kinji Kamiyama, and Kazuchika Kise. Alternatively, if we separate Ghost in the Shell and Innocence, categorize the standalone complex series into seasons 1, 2, and Solid State Society, divide Arise into its own series along with the new movie, and split standalone complex 2045 into seasons 1 and 2, this would be the 10th adaptation overall."
Bro, what are you talking about, man?
Considering the shift in production staff, one could even consider this the first installment of a second generation. The original manga is quite old, so I ask for your understanding on that point. Sorry. That said, I sincerely hope this will once again be an enjoyable visual experience in some form. End quote. Anyway, I just thought that was cute and kinda funny. In my opinion, if they can just do the bare minimum of avoiding any cringeworthy, more generic, cliche, forced dystopian stuff or goofy modernisms and Scarlett Johanssonisms, and instead focus on fun, riveting, cyberpunk police procedural adventures with interesting sci-fi concepts and either fresh new iterations or a return to form with classic editions of the characters that we love, I think that we'll probably be fine. Or at least that's how I'm feeling right now anyway. I think the biggest question on everyone's minds, at least on mine, comes down to the character iterations themselves though. We see now what they look like, more retro stylized, in line with the original manga, and perhaps a bit more goofy and even cute looking across the board, but how will they act? Will they stick with the more serious, introspective, cold, brooding, strong, silent type demeanors of the characters from the movie and series that in many ways popularized the franchise to a wider audience, and frankly still have a hold on the broader identity of the series as a whole to this day? Or will they also lean harder into not just the original character art, but also the original character demeanors and dynamics, which were a bit more bubbly and filled with comic relief vibes? I'm willing to bet on the latter based on the art style and Science Saru's more recent works, but obviously this is once again still purely speculative at this stage. The bigger question still lies with, well, Motoko. The original Motoko, who some have referred to as a sort of vacation-obsessed, carpet-munching chaos goblin, who nonetheless knows when to get serious for the job. And after finally reading at least a little bit of the uncut version of the manga in the Kodansha bilingual edition I recently imported, I'd say that this description is for good reason. I have to wonder if that's the Motoko that we're going to be getting. It would certainly be entertaining and fresh, and I'd really like to see the spirit of the original in animation at last. Is that a huge departure from what I know and love and am more used to in the Mamoru Oshii movie and standalone complex, two of my favorite pieces of media of all time? Yeah, it's a lot different, but I'm kind of hoping for something that fresh and ironically original, for what's old to become new once again, as they say. And this following part is going to be a pretty long tangent, but it's one which led me down some interesting research rabbit holes surrounded by common misconceptions that I felt were worth clarifying, especially after doing said research anyway. So I guess in case anyone's wondering what I think the chances of us getting to see the original boat scene in anime form, I doubt it. I don't think we'll be getting any virtual reality enhanced Sesbian Lex unless the show becomes incredibly popular and spawns some fan art. Like, maybe you could make the argument that some really explicit stuff made its way into their Devilman Crybaby adaptation, but Dandadan is the studio's most recent and arguably most popular work, and for all the talk of it being maximally unfiltered as an adaptation, in reality, it cut tons of momentarily explicit imagery and fan service after the mostly uncut first episode. Also, Masamune Shirow has himself, to my understanding, said that he was actually the one who wanted this sequence of explicit pages censored in new publications.
You can't keep getting away with it!
Such as this new Kodansha published compilation omnibus, ironically entitled The Fully Compiled Complete Classic Manga, even though it is, of course, censored. A beautiful scan, but censored nonetheless. Now, according to the threads and forums where I initially discovered this information, he basically seemed to feel that these were the kinds of immature, degenerate things that he drew as a kid, and that he felt that they didn't really contribute to the plot, which is kind of hard to believe, knowing that he's also made full compilations such as this one. But it would appear that it's impossible, fittingly enough, that it's impossible to find any direct sources detailing his actual reasoning. So maybe that part is all made up. Maybe it's all hearsay and the game of telephone. Maybe it's just the usual talking points which are also mentioned in articles which discuss this very topic. Speaking of articles on said topic, what I was able to find was this article by Bleeding Cool and this article by Medium, where they both state that Kodansha themselves are on record saying that they would have been willing to publish the uncensored version had Shiro Masamune permitted it. So to quote Bleeding Cool's article, where they state that the publisher reached out to them directly, I quote, "First off, this was not the result of censorship. The section was redrawn by the author, which is an important distinction. The goal of this new hardcover edition is to present the manga while respecting the author's intentions as much as possible, which is why we kept the right-to-left reading format and, most importantly, restored Shirow's hand-drawn sound effects, a first for an English edition of Ghost in the Shell. One of the questions we asked the author while going through editorial was which version of this passage he wanted us to use, and he asked us to use the redrawn version. I understand that it's not what some readers are looking for, and it's not the version that appears in the older Japanese editions, but it was the author's choice, not ours. We did not push him to choose the redrawn versions, and would have been happy to publish the original pages if that had been his desire." End quote. Once again, that's allegedly a quote directly from Kodansha, the publisher of this version, which I mentioned before. And once again, if you're looking for an uncensored version with English included, this also Kodansha published Kodansha Bilingual Comics Edition can be imported fairly cheaply. You can find it on Amazon by some Japanese sellers as well as eBay, of course. Oh, and for the record, with that said, that is only volume 1 of 3. I don't think there's anything that explicit that would have needed to be cut in the second and third volumes, but for the record, just the first volume. But it is a pretty good scan with all of the color pages that you would expect. And I actually really appreciate that it has the, once again, bilingual edition here, so you can look at the Japanese directly side by side with the English translations, which is really cool. But anyway, once again, I wasn't able to find any direct sources for the claimed reasons why Shiro Masamune chose not to permit the original uncensored versions and instead opted for his redraws, so it's difficult to know whether these were the real reasons he wanted them censored or whether people are just choosing to assume that he made the usual arguments that people so often make, as well as the same arguments levied in favor of said censorship in the article by Medium, where they call it a so-called prurient scene that adds nothing to the narrative. Nonetheless, whether or not these were actually Shirow's reasons for using the censored or redrawn version, I'll go ahead and tackle this argument anyway, that such scenes add nothing to the narrative. Because I, of course, completely disagree on multiple fronts, in fact, and I think that people are far too quick to pretend that elements of stories like these don't contribute just because they're degenerate or uncomfortable or allegedly juvenile and shallow. I think that this scene 100% contributes to the characterization of Motoko, the technology, and the world building. As is stated in the Bleeding Cool article on the censorship debacle as well, this scene does firmly establish new information, that is to say that Motoko is in fact bisexual. Now, while they do go on to try and use this to push their personal agenda, labeling her as an LGBT heroine, it is also true that this scene does in fact characterize Motoko in that way and brings us that new information about her. But that is not at all where the contributions of this scene end. The fact that Motoko, a high-ranking agent in Section 9 of all people, would use modified tech for these officially unapproved and degenerate purposes with her girlfriends, and also the fact that there would of course be an underground black market for such a thing in this world, enriches and adds depth and arguably moral grays to Motoko as a character. It at least illustrates the fact that she's willing to, fly under the radar, even as a major in Section 9. It enriches her and the world that she inhabits in facets of society and culture and the use of technology underground that are in fact, frankly, way more real than what many authors are willing to go into. The sad reality is, if a scene like this were described in a novel, like Brave New World, for example, and you, of course, might bring any of these scenes related to the fictional drug Soma to mind for how that might be implemented if you're familiar with the novel. Once again, fittingly enough, she's on vacation and Soma in Brave New World is used as a drug to, elicit vacation-like hallucinogenic effects, essentially. Brave New World is really good, by the way. You should read it if you haven't. But if a scene like this were described in a novel like Brave New World, a classic piece of text-only literature, most people reading it would understand these implications, as they do about the drug Soma in Brave New World. How they're interesting and how they do in fact contribute to the characterization of certain characters and to the world building of said science fiction societies. But because manga is a visual medium and because the art in Ghost in the Shell is visually pleasing and titillating, as it by all rights should be, people's brains literally just turn to mush when discussing it. People have to either pull out their pitchforks and get offended, or on the opposite end of the spectrum, try and turn it into an opportunity to push their personal pet agendas instead of simply seeing the scene for what it is. A bold, funny, sexy scene which also characterizes Motoko, as well as the technology and the science fiction world that she inhabits in shockingly interesting ways upon further analysis, if you just look at the scene at face value. And it does all this within like 2.5 pages. Just 2.5 pages of explicit content. And yet, that's enough for people to completely turn their brains off and ignore, outright freaking refuse to even acknowledge that there is literal freaking world building occurring in said pages. Why? Because it's too sexual? You just have to ignore that there's real intellectual content there because it's too sexual? It's so stupid. Also, just as importantly, it just makes for a better punchline to the joke setup when you're reading the original uncensored version of the manga. When Bato tries to reach Motoko's communication channel on her day off and immediately experiences secondhand the virtually enhanced Tesbian Lex jump scare, which his virtual body is literally not even compatible with, and you see the images and the sensations that are flooding his brain as he tries to knock it out. That's infinitely funnier than the censored redrawn version, and it's not even close. The censored version loses literally all context for the joke and basically doesn't even make sense as a joke anymore. The original uncensored so-called prurient version is actually literally better in every way. It's more visually pleasing, it has more intellectual content, not less, and it's funnier. And those are the only reasons I like the uncensored version better.
That's a fucking lie.
Then again, for the record and for full transparency, since writing this original script, another new English release of the manga has actually been announced, entitled The Ghost in the Shell Legacy Edition Manga Box Set, which is apparently, confusingly enough, going to be a reprint of the original fully uncensored version.
You fucking with me, right?
And who is publishing it but Penguin Random House, of all publishers. Yes, somehow our saviors from the censorship of Japanese classic sexually explicit manga is the same publisher who is usually publishing Philip K. Dick. Ayn Rand, and Friedrich Nietzsche. What a strange timeline, and way to make all of my previous research into this whole ordeal all the more confusing. Like, did Shirow simply change his mind after seeing the backlash to the publication of the censored version? Was this all an elaborate ruse to sell us the same manga compilation twice? Did Kodansha literally just lie to us about the last release and Shirow's wishes? Did Bleeding Cool and Medium just make up the Kodansha quote? Who knows, man? Once again, the only thing that I can really confirm is that the compiled manga is in fact censored, and according to websites like Medium and Bleeding Cool, as well as many, Reddit threads and forums floating around the internet, Kodansha is allegedly on record stating that they would have been happy to publish it had the author permitted it. And all of the rest is of course secondhand information at best. It's entirely possible that Shirow Masamune simply feared bad press or whatever if he approved the uncensored version and is now approving it once again because people turned out to in fact be mad about the censorship of the compilation instead. Who would have thought that people would get mad about paying money for a product that's literally missing content? But anyway, that's all speculation. I have yet to find a direct original source for the details of these claims, quotes from Kodansha themselves, directly from Kodansha, or directly from Shirow Masamune, so who freaking knows, to be honest. Nonetheless, I could not find this topic properly explored and fully compiled anywhere else, so now here it is in the middle of this video for some reason. But anyway, I nonetheless strongly doubt the very most explicit stuff from the original is going to make it in personally, unless it's heavily edited to be made more tasteful. I do think that we can expect both the funny and the sex appeal based on the promotional art, and especially if they're closely sourcing the original manga. I just don't want anyone getting their hopes up, myself included, that the very most explicit, unhinged, and controversial material might be getting in. Once again, a lot of that stuff is in fact missing from the studio's most popular recent adaptation after all, and that's a series which is actually way more tame. But here's hoping for a Christmas miracle and the completely unhinged adaptation that I do think we rightfully deserve after all these years. But anyway, there's a lot of questions that could still be asked. It remains to be seen whether they'll stick to the more familiar plot beats and villains and the like, whether they'll stick faithfully to the manga story, which has never really been adapted in any sort of direct and faithful way, whether they'll do something more in line with the most popular adaptations from years past, or whether they'll take the liberties to do their own thing with the world and characters simply being a springboard of sorts for something entirely fresh and new. But either way, I am feeling the hype, my friend. It feels like Ghost in the Shell might actually be back in a way that it has not been back in decades, frankly, and I could not be much more excited to see what's to come, whatever it might be. But anyway, that's enough yapping. We'll get our answers sometime in 2026, I guess. Hope that you have a good one. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. Peace. Holy cow, how did that end up being 44 minutes?